so it will have a local.
Okay, so it should be fine.
Yeah. So hello everyone, all the participants who are here with us today. I am doing this pre-recorded session with Sayantani Dasgupta, and you all missed my fangirling just before this, so lucky you've been spared that. Sayantani Dasgupta, Dr. Sayantani Dasgupta, of course, is the amazing author of these books which are behind me, the Kiran Mala books and Debating Darcy, which is Ikhane, and Force of Fire, which I'm reading right now, Crown of Flames, which has not arrived in India yet, and the upcoming Rosewood, which is that. The upcoming Rosewood, which is based on Sense and Sensibility, like Debating Darcy is based on Pride and Prejudice. Dr. Dasgupta is a pediatrician by training and teaches narrative medicine at Columbia University, which you all know from her bio. So without waiting any further, your Kiranmala books are, of course, they draw so much from Thakumar Jhuli. But with Pinky's story, with Force of Fire, your metaphors are not subtle. It's not this sort of subversive subtlety that goes on in Kiranmala about resistance. But in Pinky, you are very frank about where you're coming from. So maybe you could talk a bit about, to begin with, what these histories are that you're drawing from, what your personal connection to these histories are, how you have negotiated with them growing up, and of course, how they translate to the books.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be even virtually here. I'm very sorry that I can't be here in real time, but as we were just saying, time zones are time zones. One thing I think that's different between the Kiranmala books, which, so actually, let me just back up and say why I wrote the Kiranmala books. So I'm a pediatrician by training. I teach at a university. I never thought I would be writing children's books, but I grew up in this country. My parents are immigrants from Kolkata to the US. And when I was growing up, I never, ever got to see somebody who looked even vaguely like me. Forget Bengali, forget Indian, even some non-white characters were just not present in the books I was reading, US or British books I was reading, in the films I was watching, the television programs I was, exposed to, etc. And although I loved everything from, I was a big book reader, everything from Little Women to Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. I had many, many favorite books. That idea that someone like me could never be the protagonist or hero of a story remained with me. And it kind of gave me this feeling of, well, maybe someone like me doesn't deserve to even be the protagonist or hero of a story. And I think that this is a very common experience for children of color growing up in predominantly white countries, in America, in Europe, etc. But many years later, fast forward 30 years later, my own children are growing up in this country, in the US, and they are saying to me, Mama, we love Percy Jackson, we love Artemis Fowl, but where are the heroes who look like us? And so I reached back to the Thakumar Jhuli stories I had heard from my own Dida and my long kind of vacations to Kolkata growing up. And I wrote, I don't even have them handy, I'll hold up my computer case. I wrote the Kiranmala stories. And in those stories, immigration was the metaphor. There you go. They're in my closet. I would have to get up to get them. In those stories, they were Bengali folktale or Thakumar Jhuli meets string theory. Because I like this idea that immigrant families are space explorers. They're galaxy hoppers. They can have one foot in Kolkata, one foot in New York. They can switch from mach bhat to, whatever sandwiches. They can switch language. They can switch tenor of behavior. And so that was kind of the overarching notion, was to talk about the immigrant experience and an immigrant daughter who has to travel across the universe, as it were, to discover the truth about herself and her family and to discover her own superpowers, And so sometimes, especially back in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, many years ago, when I would go to Kolkata and, there wasn't that gate bridge, you would open the airplane door and walk down the steps, and the humidity, you would open the door and the humidity would be like, and suddenly, people were speaking Bangla and they looked like me, and everything smelled different and looked different and felt different. And it was a little bit like coming into a different multiverse. And so that's where the Kiranmala books were from. However, I ended up writing for Sapphire. As you all know, politics in the US has been troubling, of course, in, India as well, in many places of the world, but I'll stick to the US. Politics in the US was really in, the last number of years has become very anti-immigrant. There have been, some real, both oppressive kind of forces and forces of resistance. And so I became really interested in writing about what resistance looks like. And because I had gone to Takumarjuli, I wanted to set, that notion of resistance in the same world, but I wanted to draw from my own dadu's experiences. He had, they're from Chadga, they're from Chittagong, and he had been involved as a 15-year-old, I think, under Masterda, under Shujashen, he had been involved in the armory raid, the Chittagong armory raid. And he had actually gone to prison, gone to jail, till on and off. I think he was in prison, then released and in prison, but on and off between 15 and 23. He had done his school, finished his schooling. He had, talked about kind of the community of freedom fighters, but, it was also, I'm sure, a very difficult time. He got beriberi when he was there. He had many illnesses. He lived into his 90s, but he had many illnesses over his life because of just that early, kind of bad treatment. And he had passed away a number of years ago, and I had wanted to really reach back into his experience and think about what resistance might look like for young people. And then, of course, I had to center that story about resistance and freedom fighting in a metaphorical way. And so the Serpent Empire becomes a very thinly veiled, metaphor for British imperialists. Pinky, our heroine, is a reluctant heroine. She's a Rakushi heroine. But she becomes the one who has to figure out, is it better to fight for herself and what she wants? Or is it better to kind of take your individual needs and subsume them for the greater good? And so that's where Force of Fire came from.
I would say that maybe there are aspects of historical fiction that you're rewriting as fantasy in the books. So was there any research that you did apart from, of course, the stories from your own family? And what would you say is, because this is after all a writing workshop, what would you say is the importance of doing the research to back up what you're writing?
I mean, I think research comes in many ways. I think if you're writing, for instance, I wrote like a biography of Dr. Virginia Apgar, who was the anesthesiologist who came up with the Apgar test, which was a test for children. That's a nonfiction biography. The sort of research I had to do was very different. I had to go to the archives, look at her old writings. Luckily I had access to her medical school applications, to documents like that. The research I did for both the Kiranmala books and later the Pinky books, the Fire Queen books, is both, having heard the Takumarjuli stories, but then having to go back to them. In many years ago, my mother and I had translated a number of them. So I went back to our own translations, but then I went back to the originals. So part of the research was refamiliarizing myself and re-entering that world. And then I had to do, plenty of research, despite my grandfather's no longer with me. And so I had to do and the people he had fought with are no longer with us, right? It's many years later. So I watched, there's a wonderful film called Chittagong, which I watched. I did, some documentary research. I did textual research. Even though, the actual armory raid doesn't even appear in the book, I felt like I had to become familiar with it enough that even if it was a sidelong mention, it was coming from a real place of research. And of course, because it's fantasy, I have the scope to not stick to the original historical facts. But what I hope is the essence of those historical events. So even if I'm not recreating this happened in 1939, then this happened in 1941, that's not what I'm writing because I'm writing fantasy. But I think you have to stick to kind of the heart, the essence of what was happening. And so similarly, obviously the language martyrs or the Bhasha Andolan, in Bangladesh is happening at a very different time period from my own grandfather's experience. But because those were also stories that I, grew up with, maybe isn't the right word, but was influenced by, and am inspired by, and because it's fantasy, what I was able to do was kind of take various aspects of, history, of Indian history, Bangladeshi history, Bengali history, and try to make sure that I was entrenched in them enough that then my fantasy came from a place of real emotional resonance, even if it wasn't coming from a place of historical accuracy. There's this fabulous field called oral history, a subfield of history that I often teach from. And in oral history, they often say that oral stories have a different kind of truth. They have an emotional truth when people tell you stories. And even though these weren't oral histories that I was building off of, I was trying to go for doing a lot of research, but then going for the emotional truth of what I was researching, as opposed to the factual truth, if that makes sense.
Which leads me to my next question, which I think you partly answered that already, but was it a conscious decision to write fantasy rather than mundane realism?
I mean, I wouldn't call realism mundane. There's beautiful realism. I am very interested in fantasy as a way so I'm influenced by, American writers, like Black American writers, African American writers like Octavia Butler, who used fantasy to write about, not even write about oppression, to write our way through oppression, to write, you can't be what you can't see. So I feel like the job of a fantasist is to create the world as we would see it, to create images of revolution, of freedom, of anti-oppression in ways that maybe don't even exist yet. And I think that's the benefit of fantasy. So I have to go, apologies to people who are Tolkien fans. I am a big, Lord of the Rings fan, but my apologies beforehand. There is some analysis of the Oxford fantasists, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Lewis Carroll. They were all Oxford dons. They were academics. They taught it. I am an academic, right? So I feel that kinship to them. But the type of fantasy they were writing, there's a very interesting kind of analysis of them, and I'll send it to you, Ritwika, later. A book that I've been reading that says, at the time that these novelists, fantasists, not just novelists, fantasists were writing, the British Empire was kind of going down, right? And so they were writing an empire of the mind. They were writing fantasies of colonialism, of all these creatures who kind of behave the same, new lands that are being conquered by higher creatures, who are going to take care of lower creatures. So there were all these kind of eugenics themes, colonialist themes that they were writing onto the bodies of hobbits and elves and whatnot. And what I would like to do, and what I think I am inspired by is the tradition of people who are doing the opposite, who are thinking about anti-colonial narratives and how we can achieve them, or at least begin to envision them and begin practicing the sorts of methods of resistance we might need through fantasy novels.
The whole idea of getting inspired by the opposite, of course, I think is very evident in your very fiercely feminist space that you're coming from. And it was not going to be my next question, but I'll make it my next question, is that you talk about radical imagination in a TED Talk. And you have, I'm quoting from your Hornbook magazine article, which is, writing of my joy and Kiranmala's is a political act. So where do you, it's a tightrope that I think that you're walking, of course, in being political in your writing, but also remembering that it is for children or young people, it's for youth. How do you navigate that tightrope? How do you balance that? And how would you recommend and advise our participants to be balancing that?
To balance that. You know, I think we all have to find our own voice. And different authors can more directly give a lesson, but that is not me. I am not a didactic writer, or I try not to be. I do enough of that even in a classroom, honestly. I'm not a didactic professor. I tend to do seminar style. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, says we all come with knowledge to the room. And so in a sense, and we all must kind of pose problems together in classrooms. So in a classroom, I tend not to be didactic. And similarly, in my writing, I have the same philosophy, which is young readers are brilliant. Young readers have so much capacity to imagine that which is not real, that which is beyond the boundaries of our, kind of adult thinking. I want to respect young readers, and I love young readers. And so what I want to do is really meet them where they are, give them a cracking good story, characters who they can, sink their teeth into, root for, but also characters who aren't too perfect, because none of us is perfect. So flawed characters who will change over time, who, are fun and silly, just like young people are, but who are also facing real issues. Do I stand up for what's right, even at a cost to myself? Do I take a risk and, put myself out there? How do I even figure out what's right and wrong? These are questions young people, I think, are really having to deal with and are dealing with. And especially in this country, and again, I don't know if this is universal, but I think in multicultural countries, in multicultural situations, often marginalized communities are looked to tell stories of great sadness. It's so hard to be an immigrant. And let me teach you about Diwali, or let me teach you about whatever. And that's all fine and well, but I just don't feel like those sorts of books are geared toward immigrant children. I'm interested in writing to the children who will identify with these identities, and then everyone else, absolutely, if they find joy in the stories, that's great. But I'm really not interested in teaching about immigrant children. I'm interested in writing for them. And so once you make that distinction, who am I writing for? Not about, but for. Then I think this question of joy, silliness mixed up with, kind of serious issues becomes more clear, because then you're not writing for your professor, you're not writing for the reviewer, you're not writing for the market necessarily. You're writing for, who are you writing for? Who are the young people you're writing for, or older people you're writing for?
There's a wall hanging behind you, I think, which is showing up on the screen sometimes, and it looks like a mukut on your head.
Does it here?
Wonderfully appropriate.
Here, I can, let me see it. That's what it is.
Yes, it looks like a mukut over your head. It's wonderfully appropriate, because that's making me think of my next question, which is, I think a very standard writing advice that is given is write what you know. But that could apply to anything. You could be writing about the instruction manual for a washing machine when you're writing what you know. But when it comes to fiction, particularly, how do you again straddle that, navigate that space between writing from a personal history and a personal identity and fictionalizing it? How do you see yourself in fiction?
I think you both write what you know, but you also write in order to discover yourself. So all of these books are me constantly trying to tell myself the story of myself, if that doesn't sound too narcissistic. It's about self-discovery. And I think if you, in a sense, the more personal you make it and the more specific you make it, and the more crystal clear you are about your intentions, okay, I am an immigrant daughter. I am writing about an immigrant daughter because I myself want to think through what it was to grow up like this. I am somebody interested in political resistance. I am also the descendant of people who were involved in political resistance. What does it mean to negotiate that heritage, right? So I'm constantly trying to tell myself the story of myself. I don't know it yet until I write it. And in a sense, I have this great former professor who would say, we make things fictional to make them real. Like we have to tell these stories, maybe fictional stories about ourselves to even understand ourselves. And so I know that's contradictory. I'm both writing from an actual family history, but the reason I'm writing it and the reason I'm kind of spinning fantastic yarns about it is I'm trying to find my place in those histories constantly. I'm trying, it's like a moon and satellites. If my history is the center, what is my orbit? How do I circulate around these stories that I've grown up with, and who am I, and what is the shape of my life? What is the space I occupy? What are the parts that I'm keeping with me? What are the parts that I'm discarding, either because they don't serve me or because I'm not even aware of them? So I'm constantly actually trying to figure out what I know in the process of writing, if that doesn't sound too airy-fairy and mysterious.
Listen, and it sounds like that there's a beautiful image in Kioskast where Kiran and Neil, they travel through the multiverses and they see all these things in the universe. It sort of sounds like that because all these stories together make us who we are. And I mean, I'm sure you know that we, growing up in a post-colonial nation, we have tended to consume a lot of Western fiction, whether that be children's books or adult books, because YA is, again, a relatively new genre in India itself. There's also a resistance from parents against reading books which are maybe too realistic, not keeping with the whole childhood innocence sort of idea. What would your advice be to the youth who are not just reading the YA, who are maybe also facing opposition to reading that YA, and who maybe want to write that YA?
Read all the things. I mean, you can read all the things. In this country too, you get that like, no, they must read the classics sort of pushback from parents, or no, the graphic novel isn't real. For younger children, they'll say a graphic novel, that's not real reading. They must read A Secret Garden, which is like this terrible racist book. Why would I give a child A Secret Garden? As if I remember somebody, so side note on A Secret Garden, growing up, Bengali, growing up Indian in the US, everybody hands you The Secret Garden. There's like, you'll love this book. And it's the worst. All the Indian immigrant people I know were all handed The Secret Garden by some teacher. Anyway, sometimes I'll often make this expression, stories are good medicine, but I think as parents or as educators, we're interpreting that statement wrongly. We're interpreting it as, take your penicillin, it's medicine. You have to swallow these, you have to swallow these stories and like, it will be good for you. And that then will turn a young person off to reading forever, because reading stops becoming a space of joy, of self-discovery, of freedom. It becomes, it becomes this like terrible, bitter thing, right? That somebody else is like jamming in your mouth. Freedom of reading choice, I think, at every stage from littlehood to teenagehood to up, it breeds at readers. You know, the more somebody is able to choose what they read, the more they're going to read. And so they're going to read everything from Debating Darcy to Chekhov to every, you know, because they're choosing what they're going to read. And I think that reading is a muscle, and it's an emotional muscle as well as an intellectual muscle. And if you turn off the emotional joy, the intellectual muscle won't grow either, because I think young people will then treat reading as a chore, as something they don't like. And that's, I hope, not what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise people to read and then write.
I'm so fascinated listening to you. I can't remember my next question. I'm looking through my notes to see what I had noted down.
No, stop. I loved what you said before about the, it was so, you know, I love it when somebody will reflect back to me something I've written. And you said that thing about, you know, Kiran, Mala, and Neil, like with all the stories floating around them in the multiverse. And, you know, those are moments when somebody else is being much more articulate to you about your own intentions, and you get to learn. And I was like, oh yeah, I did write that. Thank you.
A lot of amazing things, which I'm just completely constantly blown away by. And so much so that my brain is blanking.
No. So what else might be useful? Yeah, because the people who are coming, who I'm so sorry I don't get to meet you. They're all at what level of, they're all writers, they're all coming for this writing workshop, all studying at similar levels, or?
All undergrad, postgrad students.
Okay. And people are mostly writing for young people, or they're writing
right. They want to write their own narratives, hopefully.
Okay.
Right.
Perfect. So, you know, I think that my best advice to you is, you know, Toni Morrison, the American writer, says, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, you must write it. And so my best advice to you as a writer is you have to write your book. Nobody else can tell your story but you. Nobody else has your particular take on the world, your particular family position, subject position, your particular life experience. And I really, the world needs all of our stories. And so I think you have to write it. You have to give yourself permission to write terrible first drafts. I always say, tell yourself, you know, it cannot be good. Your first draft must be a jumble. Everything, because if you don't write that, what will you edit from? Right? So give yourself permission to write. And, you know, I think that it's a lot of introspective work, I think, at first. It's who am I writing for? What am I writing? And sometimes those questions come in the writing process. Sometimes I don't figure out what I'm writing until I'm halfway through it. And then I have to go back and say, oh, I was writing about the importance of language. And let me go back and retrofit the first half of the book that I've written with that in mind. You know, I was right. So, you know, those kinds of discoveries sometimes happen before and sometimes happen in the process.
And do they happen after you send the draft to your editor, when you find all the typos coming out of the woodwork?
That's when you discover that you don't know how to spell, which is a whole other conversation.
And you try to edit it on Word and the Word tilts on its axis. Just moving a little away from The Kingdom Beyond. I keep thinking of that song, Shopne Dekha Rajkonna Thake Satsagora Tero Nodi Pare. It's a beautiful song, but moving a little from The Kingdom Beyond, there are moments in Debating Darcy where you are very vulnerable about how much of Leela is you. What brought on Debating Darcy?
I did not know that Leela was me. I'll tell you the truth. So authors sometimes don't even know what they're doing, or at least I don't sometimes know what I'm doing. It was my now, young adult children who said, Ma, it's obviously you. all that righteous outrage. Leela is the Lizzie Bennet character in Debating Darcy. All that righteous outrage, and I got very offended. I was like, that's not me. I'm not righteously out. They're like, yes, you are. So they had to hold up. So sometimes your book is a mirror and you learn. And then sometimes the person who's read your book, like, Ritwika just taught me something about the Chaos Curse, and my children taught me something about Debating Darcy, because they were like, no, that's you. I'm like, I'm not like, they're like, yes, you are. And so I didn't realize, sometimes you don't realize you're writing either your current self or your past self into a character. And I was really writing Leela. Lizzie Bennet, I think, is, we all love her in Pride and Prejudice because she's so wrong at the beginning of the book. She's so judgmental and wrong. And I think as a reader, Jane Austen's trick is that you see through her eyes and you think, oh no, this is the protagonist, I'll trust her. Her perspective on the world must be correct. And as a reader, it's only maybe midway through the narrative that you realize, oh, wait a minute, she's an emotionally untrustworthy narrator. She's not, in any terrible negative way, but she is fooling herself, And so I wanted to write a character similarly who was fooling herself, who was thinking she had it all down, and this rich guy from this private school, he was definitely no good, and she understood everything. And even as an older, not teenager, but certainly as a teenager, I think all of us, we think we have it all down, and we don't. We have to learn. And I think the best friendships, the best relationships are the ones that make us grow and see ourselves better and become a better version of ourselves. And so that's what I'm hoping happens to Leela. That's her arc. But that's also, Jane Austen has that be, she does many other things wonderfully, but that's also Lizzie Bennet's arc. Jane Bennet doesn't get much of an arc in the original. She's perfect all along. But Lizzie Bennet changes, she's wrong in the beginning. And that's kind of what I was going for.
For Feroz and Leela's sake, I hope they work it out and they stick it through to their 90. And yeah, I hope they become like a teen couple who separate in college. But right at the beginning, you've dedicated the book to for all the brown girls who dreamt of gossamer gowns, only to realize you were already wearing crowns. I'm not going into the sub dedication. But I mean, we've seen Bridgerton and we've had the amazing Simone Ashley. I mean, second season crushed my dreams because it was so different from the book, and it ruined Edwina's character in my opinion. But Simone Ashley as Kate was incandescent. She was something to behold. But why revisiting Jane Austen? Was it something specific that you decided that I will take up Austen and I will rewrite Austen? Why not some other author who is equally?
Oh, because I'm a huge Jane Austen nerd. We all have our favorites. So I was in Kolkata. It was hot. Our US summer vacations are June to August. So it's a long vacation. My cousins were in school. It was still, June, July, early, they weren't off yet. So I was bored at home. My grandfather had these beautiful bookshelves with 3 deep books, but they were all like Chekhov and Dostoevsky and stuff. And I was 11 or 12. I was too young to read them. And my mother handed me this book. She said, I think you'll like this. And it said Pride and Prejudice on it. And I thought it would be kind of a lecture book. Don't be prideful. Don't be prejudiced. And I was like, no, that's not for me. I'm not going to like this book. And because I was bored, despite arguing with my mother about it, I read it. And then I couldn't admit to her how much I loved this book because I'd argued with her about it. And I was 12 and I had to be right. So I Lukia, I would secretly read I'm sure she knew. I would secretly read the book, whatever it is. And I loved it. It was this book about love and friendship and sisterhood, and I was an only child, and so I always gravitated to these family stories. And it was a book about wit, and it was a book about people who use sentences like swords, right, and debate their way into falling in love. And I fell in love with Austen, and I had this idea to put myself in the story, like any good fangirl, for years, but I didn't have the bravery to do it. I said, I'm not going to do it justice because to me, Jane Austen, yes, is about romance and yes, is about cultural critique. But to me, if you're not doing it funny, because Jane Austen is hilarious, right? If you're not funny enough, you're not doing it right. And so I was nervous. I was like, can I do it? I don't know. And then the pandemic came and I was locked in my house for a year, whatever it was. And I said, okay, even if nobody buys it, I'm writing this for myself. And that's how that came about.
You mentioned funny. So just again, little writing advice question. When writing fantasy or whatever you're writing, whatever the genre is, how do you balance and maintain the humor with the seriousness, the gravity of it? How do you stop it from getting too morbid or too how do you maintain that joy? Because it's so easy when you're writing about political activism. It's so easy to fall into traps of utter seriousness with no space for joy. So,
I mean, I think everybody has a different voice. There are writers who don't write funny, who are beautiful, amazing writers. It just happens to be my voice because that's also my personality. You know, there's a US activist, Emma Goldman, who said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution. And that's a little bit me. Like, I both want to be a part of the revolution, but I also want to dance. You know, I feel like that's how we, you know, Bell Hooks talks about self-care as a revolutionary act. And I think humor is a revolutionary act. I think if we can, you know, people in charge don't like to be poked fun of, right? The people with power. So I think that that's a subversive activity if you poke fun at those in power. And I think you have to poke fun at yourself too. I think that's how we grow. But that's me. I think that not everyone has to write funny. That's what I've discovered about my writerly voice. But that said, for me, humor is really important. It's a really important way to deflect and house more serious themes. Fantasy, for, you know, one set of books, fantasy and humor, and then humor in the Austen books are a really good way to kind of house serious themes. And then, of course, I'm trying to pay homage to Austen herself, who is, you know, many wonderful things, but really, really funny. And she uses humor as a way to critique women's roles or inheritance or classism. And, you know, that's what I was trying to kind of parallel.
I think a lot of people also forget that Austen is fiercely feminist in her own time. And of course, so are you. And so I try to be the same. And hopefully, young people will also continue to embrace feminism in their lives. But given how much of a bad name feminism gets from establishments, how important is feminism, in your opinion, to writing youth fiction?
I mean, I think liberatory politics, however you choose to name it, if for some reason, you know, all feminism is understanding that gender oppression is a system of oppression that is bad for all of us, no matter what our gender, that locks all of us in to kind of unfair structures and then unfair and often violent lives. But I think that, you know, liberatory politics, really thinking through, you know, again, imagining a future in which all of us are welcomed, all of our children are celebrated, all of our families are centered, is at least my agenda. I grew up in a feminist household. My mother, you know, immigrated to the US and then formed one of the first anti-violence organizations aimed at South Asian American, you know, women, more South Asian American people in this country. So that was my upbringing. I was kind of brought up in those feminist contexts. I was also, I grew up hearing stories about, my Thakuban, my, Dadu's sisters who were kind of feminists at the time of the revolution, and learning how to fly planes and, all these kinds of wonderful things. And so I feel like it's both who I am and it's honoring kind of the legacy I come from. And again, something that, may be very different in the Kolkata context, but in the US context, I also think there is this notion of Asian women or Indian women as somehow the opposite of that, passive, not activist, not fiercely political. And that's, of course, a stereotype that's put on us. That's not the reality by any means. But I'm also very happy to push back against those stereotypes of, US Asian American women.
Quote you, allows you to envision who is not just allowed to survive, but also thrive. That's from your Radical Imagination TED Talk. Huh.
I love you quoting me to me. That's great.
There are things you've said which are sort of embedded deep in my brain. I've read them or heard them so often. I think one of the questions I really started sort of envisioning your segment in this event was from in India, in Indian YA, we do not see a lot of, or rather to say any engagement with partition narratives. But there is a huge amount of literature that is produced within the diaspora on partition. So, Shubhra Gilkor, of course, has her books on that. Then The Night Diary, which is, and Miss Marvel has recently highlighted the partition for so many people who weren't aware of the partition before. What sort of place does the partition have within authors in the diaspora? I mean, for authors in the diaspora, what sort of place does it hold in your lives? And when because there's so much talk about other oppressed peoples, but partition or South Asian narratives do not get spoken of a lot. How do you? Of course, you're doing that through the literature, but on a community scale, how do you sort of push back against that? How do you get your voices out there?
There's a couple of great oral history projects in the US right now, looking at, because of course, in the same way that for diasporic Jewish communities, they were losing Holocaust narratives, right? They were losing because people were getting older and passing away. And so there were big, the Shoah, there were big pushes to kind of capture the stories of people before they passed on. And I think similarly, there have been big pushes, not as big, but there've been these projects to kind of capture partition stories before those who directly experience them pass away. And I think that that's really important in the diaspora and in the subcontinent, both. For us to make sure that we're not losing these really important historical perspectives and narratives. That said, I don't have an answer. I'm not a historian, but I'm really intrigued by your question of why does the partition cast such a long shadow over diasporic writers if it does not in the subcontinent? I don't know the answer to that.
We have the Partition Museum, the Partition Archives across the country, but in YA literature, it doesn't exist. It maybe, I don't know, is it we are too close to it being in here itself, or maybe it's the distance that allows a sort of looking back, perhaps. So I'm curious about that.
Or is it that by being immigrant communities, we're necessarily already engaged in stories about rupture and stories about distance? And I wonder whether or not then, the next rupture from 2 generations ago, is also then, has so much resonance because we're already constantly engaged in stories about what is home, separation from home, forcible kind of violences, ruptures. I don't know the answer to that. But I think it's a really interesting question. In fact, my son, who is in university, is reading Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy all semester. That's his one class. Like, that's all they're doing. And he was just looking at it through, Salman Rushdie has that great collection. It's a collection of essays, and I'm going to say it wrong. I'm going to say the collection of essays wrong. But he's looking at it through Rushdie's collection of essays, and then Arundhati Roy's collection, Azadi, the more recent collection that she has. But clearly, here are people who are either diasporic by nature or have lived in, abroad, who are constantly dealing with partition and the, before and after effects of it. I, feel the weight of that history, probably because as an immigrant daughter, you're constantly, or as a diasporic person, you're constantly looking for those narratives that make sense of who you are and where you come from. And I don't know, or I have to think about how that works differently in the diaspora than in the subcontinent. I think it's an interesting question, though.
There's certainly a lot of literature for adults on partition narratives, including Rushdie's own. But this strange sort of blind spot that it's there for also makes me wonder if it ties back to the age-old idea that young people should be sort of put bubble wrapped away or isolated away from these very hard narratives. I'm not going to. I always have more questions for you, but we are almost reaching the hour, so I'm going to actually now ask if you would like to read from one of the books, a section of your choice.
Sure. Why don't I read a little bit from, because we've been talking about language and whatnot, I'll read a little bit from the middle of Force of Fire, in which our lovely young Rakhoshi, who is studying at the Ghatotkaч Academy of Murder and Mayhem, has mistakenly set her classroom on fire, as one does, and now has run away in humiliation. Look, we've all done embarrassing things in school, maybe not set classrooms on fire, but we've all done embarrassing things, so don't judge. So she has run away from her classroom with her young Kola, Mola, and Dimbo, Kachkola, Kanmola, and Dimbo, who are her cousins, her young cousins. And these are all, of course, inside jokes for Bangalis, because nobody in the US knows who Kachkola, Kanmola, and Dimbo are. So she goes into the forest, she's run away, and suddenly she hears a teacher in the woods. And again, remember, there's a lot of, my family history that's tied into these narratives of Masterda in Janka. So, I'm imagining a young teacher who's also a revolutionary in the woods. And so she comes upon this scene of a teacher teaching students. The ground was dry and dusty under our hands. The rains hadn't come yet, and the long days and short nights caused by the weakening moon were cracking the very land beneath our feet. I saw Dimbo about to sneeze from some of the dust, but quickly squeezed her nose shut with my fingers. I'm not sure if it was the nose squeeze or the fierce look on my face, but she swallowed her sneeze with a gulp. That's when I heard the sound again. Someone was singing. Not just someone, but a group of high-pitched someones. And what they were singing was the Bengali alphabet song. Little side note here, my own children went to Bangla school in the US, where the teacher set the Bangla, like Shorobarn, to Are You Sleeping, Brother John, Frere Jaka, that tune. So Oh, ah, hushi dilkui, shouted the childish voices. What in the demon's snot? With another warning look to my ridiculous relatives, I peeked up from our hiding place. What I saw almost made me laugh. I was clearly a little too on edge. It was just a small pathshala, an informal school set up by people from a nearby human village. I'd heard there were a lot of them these days, now that serpent budget cuts had made it almost impossible for regular schools to keep open. The teacher, though, didn't look like an ordinary village schoolmaster. He was pretty young, not much older than me. Even though he was wearing a patched kurta and dhuti, there was something about the way he held himself that made him seem almost royal. He had no books and no classroom but the open forest. I saw that he had drawn the sharagon in the dirt with a stick and was pointing to the vowels of the Bangla alphabet as the children sang. Bah, Darun, that was wonderful, the teacher said in a pained, unconvincing voice. I had to stifle a laugh. It was true. Those kids had been way off tune. It's very important that you learn these letters and how to put them together. You see, students, our mother language is the source of our strength. The young teacher reached down and gathered a fistful of dry red soil in his brown hand. Our language runs in the veins of this land. But why don't the snakes want us to speak Bangla, Shujida? One of the human school children was asking. The teacher they called Brother Shujja smiled, poured some soil into the boy's hand, then closed the child's small fist with his own. I know this might be hard to understand, but the thing is, destroying a people's language, not letting children learn the ways of those who came before them, is the surest way to kill a culture. So we could get in trouble for speaking our language, even with our families? A worried-looking boy with cracked eyeglasses asked the teacher. Should we stop, speak more like them? Asked a dirty-faced little one, drawing out her S's like the snakes did. You can adapt. You can learn new things. The teacher was talking to the little girl who had been speaking like the snakes. A beam of sunlight shooting through the leafy canopy illuminated his features as he spoke. You can even leave behind some beliefs of your parents that don't serve you well, but you can never forget who you are or where you came from. That is your strength. That is the source of your real power. So I'll just leave it there.
I think it goes without saying how important it is to keep your native language alive and to decolonize. How important that is, especially I think also for, because you've spoken about this before, that of course you have learned Bengali growing up as a child, and Didu writes all her mails in Bangla. She's so sweet. So Bangla has been extremely important to you. Your kids speak Bangla, but there is also that whole anti speak any language other than English, you're in America, speak English sort of thing that we read and hear about all the time. And in the face of that, it's just further activist resistance against that sort of whitewashing and it's a decolonial thing. So it's anti-colonial. So I think that goes without saying pretty much. Do you have any parting words, advice for our participants?
Write your stories, write your stories, write your stories. Nobody but you can write your story.
Thank you. And if they have any questions, I will forward them to you and we can keep the conversation going on. I will stop the recording.